better future is built by the brave, envisioned by brilliant minds, born from the passions of thousands strong. One that isn't without risk, but protected from it. Safe from all the worries and secure for what's to come. Because a better future with the greatest empires, the strongest communities, and the happiest families will always be worth having. That's why the bold and the fearless understand that recreating something better takes courage and strength. So together, let's start shaping a better future today.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our dialogue on services. I'm Patrick Chua, the convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition and lead staffer of the APEC Business Advisory Council Philippines. This virtual PPD is organized by the Asia Pacific Services Coalition and the APEC Business Advisory Council, presented to us by ABAC Philippines with the Philippine Services Coalition and Globe Telecom, together with the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide and the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Just a few reminders before we begin. Today, we are using a Zoom webinar platform. This event is also broadcasted via Facebook Live of the ABAC Philippines page. Please be advised that this meeting is being recorded for documentation purposes. As in day 1, we have a very packed program, and we hope our participants will take advantage of having our distinguished guests by posting your questions in the chat box, Q&A box. We will consolidate them and try to get our speakers to respond so we can include them in the post-event materials. Please fill out and send back the feedback form you will receive when you exit the Zoom meeting later. Please feel free to also share your topics and suggestions so we would know how to improve and get better in our future events. And so to begin with day 2 of our public-private dialogue on services, I'm honored to introduce Professor Bernard Hockman of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, where he also sits as Dean for External Relations. To give his opening remarks, please welcome Professor Bernard Hockman.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to provide these opening remarks to, I think, which is a very important topic. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have on how services can actually drive and help drive the recovery to the, from the pandemic. I mean, it's very clear that the pandemic was a huge shock to the world economy. It's also very clear that that shock was very asymmetrically distributed. And in part that I would argue depends on kind of the state of services and the ability to utilize services to kind of keep economic activity going. So I think this was a unique, hopefully a unique event. We're certainly not looking forward to a repetition anytime soon, but it constituted a mix of supply and demand shocks. And the demand shock, I think, was particularly salient for particular types of services, right? Travel, tourism, business services, anything that requires mobility was severely affected by the lockdowns that were put in place by governments in response to the pandemic. And I think there's quite a bit of research now, and maybe that will also be discussed in the course of the day, that illustrates how the impact was very differentiated across different types of sectors. Clearly, countries that were heavily dependent on tourism as a source of foreign exchange were affected very dramatically by the lockdowns. But I think the COVID episode also illustrates the resilience of a lot of these services sectors and the ability to use information, communications, technology type tools, to use the internet to adjust to this changing situation. We have many examples, and I don't have any time to go into the details, but we can think about education, we can think about telehealth, we can think about the delivery of food to households. We can think about the role that was played by logistics in particular. Think about international maritime transport. Think about the platforms like Amazon e-commerce, all of which is heavily services intensive, right? So I think services were hit hard, but I think services also were part of the reason why we've managed to come through this crisis, I guess, in better shape than otherwise would have been the case in a world where we didn't have all this information technology, where we didn't have the type of services, industries, and firms that we have today. I think in terms of lessons to draw from the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, I think it illustrates the importance of keeping markets open, of having a predictable policy environment. I think looking forward, I would expect services to be a major kind of factor in driving the recovery as mobility becomes easier, as people can begin to start traveling again. But I think the response to the supply shocks in areas like logistics in particular illustrate the importance of actually supporting internet connectivity, supporting the ability of services firms to actually allow us to both produce and consume the goods and also services that are important for households. So I think looking forward, there's a real big need to foster deeper engagement, international cooperation on services policies, and in particular to support the ability again for services to flow across borders. And that of course is associated with the free flow of data, which I'm sure will come up in the discussions yesterday and will continue to come up in the discussions today. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Hockman. It is indeed an opportune time for us to put services in the driver's seat of our road to recovery. I'm sure our next session will tell us more about this strategy. So please let me call on Lee Toothill to formally introduce our keynote session and to moderate our first keynote session for today. Lee is a visiting fellow of the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. She has extensive years of experience in doing trade negotiations and trade in services. So without further ado, let me call on Lee. Good evening, Lee.
Yes, hello. It's very interesting to be able to honestly say in our virtual world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate in this session. And it's a very, very useful conference. Without any further ado, let me introduce Ambassador Tomochika Uyama, who is working at the WTO now. And I think that obviously there's a more detailed biography on the website, but I wanted to point out three things quickly. You know, many of you may know him from his close involvement in negotiating trade agreements in the region, as well as his involvement in the negotiation of the TPP, which is now, of course, the CPTPP. He was, during a period when he was a delegate on dealing with services at the WTO, it's important to say that he chaired the GATS Committee on Specific Commitments, which is not only very important for the intellectual underpinning of the services agreement, but also the practical side of what schedules mean and what they do. Finally, the third thing is he has been serving very recently as Director General for an Office of Coronavirus Preparedness and Response within the Cabinet Secretariat. Let me just turn the floor over to Ambassador Uyama now.
Thank you, Lee. I hope you can hear my voice. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to address the Public-Private Dialogue on Services. I'd like to thank the Asia Pacific Services Coalition and the APEC Business Advisory Council, ABAC, for this invitation. I expect that talking to this audience about the importance of services will be like preaching to the converted, but I'll try. We all know that services are not only an important sector in itself, a sector that accounts for 2/3 of economic output, attracts over 2/3 of foreign direct investment, and provides most jobs globally. But services are also critical for development strategies and to stimulate sustainable and inclusive growth and development as we emerge from the pandemic. Between 2010 and 2019, global exports of commercial services grew by 57% compared to 25% growth for merchandise trade. In value-added terms, services account for close to half of the value of international goods and services trade combined. However, since the start of the pandemic, services trade has been dearly affected, and it has declined by 21% in 2020, particularly due to closing down of tourism, travel, and the temporary decrease in demand for transport. Resuming solid growth of services trade will be key to economic recovery and building resilience across the world. And this means including across APEC economies. As APEC is taking stock of progress in achieving the targets of the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap, I notice that a complex picture is emerging. On the one hand, restrictions to services trade and investment have declined on average, and importantly, in essential services such as logistics, cargo handling, maritime transport, and freight forwarding. On the other hand, across APEC economies, there are still significant restrictions in certain sectors, including those that are digitally enabled, many of which we also today see as essential. As vaccine production is ramped up across the globe, essential services are also a key component here as well. As the two upcoming sessions will explore, I believe that accelerating digital transformation and boosting services competitiveness post-pandemic will be key for APEC economies to meet the targets of their services competitiveness roadmap. Now, technologies indeed offer the possibility of sharply reducing high trade costs in some services sectors, offering major potential gains. Let me say, the multilateral trading system has a crucial role to play in recovery. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to ask everyone here to support the WTO and its 12th Ministerial Conference, or the MC12. At the WTO, the digital economy has been the focus of members in the work program and the JSI, Joint Statement Initiative. A memorandum on the imposition of customs duties to electronic transmissions in force since 1998 benefits businesses, consumers, and the digital economy. Its extension will be a key issue at MC12. Over recent years, 86 WTO members have been engaging in negotiations aimed at developing new rules for digital trade and have made good progress. One aspect that is lagging behind in the WTO is progress on the Services Market Access Fund. While many negotiators in the JSI on electronic commerce understand the need to update the outdated GATS commitments with regard to digital services, multilateral discussions on restarting market access talks are still in an exploratory phase. An important area of progress, on the other hand, is services domestic regulation. On 27th September 2021, a group of members working plurilaterally concluded the text-based negotiations on a reference paper on services domestic regulation. This reference paper has been designed with the objective of increasing the transparency and predictability of regulatory frameworks and removing procedural bottlenecks in the services sector. We all know how crucial this is for services suppliers. The participating members, 65 at present, covering 90% of world services trade, aim to finalize their negotiations by the MC12. If implemented, this outcome may lead to substantial reductions in trade costs, as the OECD will explain later. And recent WTO research suggests that an outcome on services domestic regulation also has the potential to boost participation of implementing economies in services trade in global value chains and raise the level of entrepreneurship, thereby fostering the competitiveness of services markets. APEC economies have already endorsed substantively equivalent principles on domestic regulation in the services sector. However, not all APEC economies have yet joined the WTO process. But I'm confident that by joining this negotiation, APEC economies will lend further credibility to their ongoing and ambitious internal regulatory reforms. In the coming sessions, I'm sure you will hear more about these areas of work, but let me conclude by re-emphasizing that services are becoming the predominant drivers of trade. They facilitate digital adaptation and improve market access and the regulatory environment for trade, including digital trade. Services will have a key role to play in a post-COVID economic recovery that is sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. I thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very astute observations. As I would expect, you're having experience in trade negotiations and in services. Let's go a little deeper on some of the issues you raised. Let's maybe look at the digital transformation issues that the next panel will explore. We've seen in the pandemic, experts in both trade and telecommunications have observed that it has accelerated digitization of business and business models. not only what our people are doing online. And consequently, this has accelerated the uptake, as Bernard noted, in ICT and ICT-enabled trade. In your view, what does this imply for the recovery of trade in essential services such as finance, logistics, transport, as well as for the resilience of trade in goods and services overall looking forward?
Thank you very much. This is a very big question. I try to respond to the extent possible. We can see the evidence of the accelerated digitalization in our personal life and also in our professional lives. This has also impacted also in the Asia-Pacific region, while sectors such as tourism and logistics have been hard hit. Other services in the digital sphere, such as telecommunications and digitally traded services, have excelled and met the challenge. So what we have seen is not only resilience of digitalized services during the pandemic, but also an acceleration of digital platforms and services throughout economies and into sectors that were not traditionally relying on as much on digital services. So essential services such as finance, logistics, you mentioned, will already depend heavily on digital technology, and that helped them through this. At the same time, it has ramped up. Much of this adaptation of business and traders is expected to become permanent, leading to overall reduction in trade costs. I expect that the trend will contribute to sustainable business and trade expansion. Thank you.
Ambassador, let's look at your real strength in being with us today. Let's talk about the WTO and the GATS, in which you're a longtime expert in particular. Do you believe that the features of the WTO offer support for recovery and resilience from the pandemic and beyond the pandemic? For example, how do the rules on foster digital trade and competitiveness?
Well, thank you very much. I think this the role of the trade rules and trade commitments, like in the WTO, has been sort of receiving more and more good understanding these days. And the while I was in the Geneva, as Liz said, around 1998, actually we were starting a robust discussion on e-commerce. And at that time, there was a question about this digital trade or e-commerce. Does this really fit in the WTO framework, or is it supposed to be a kind of third category, not good or not in services? And I think part of this discussion is still going on, but at that time, it was clear, and that's actually been codified in a sense by the dispute settlement process by panel reports, is that actually the commitments in the services, it should be interpreted as the technologically neutral. So this is a very important principle. And that means when our society is going to become more digitalized, the cross-border, for example, cross-border services trade commitments can be in principle apply. Those commitments apply to digital trade. And so this is very important interpretation of the WTO. And that means the rules and the commitments of the WTO really create stability and predictability for business environment. So I think I'd like to emphasize this is the meaning of this is getting more important compared with 1998, even particularly after the COVID situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You know, considering where you sit, you mentioned that there is some rulemaking underway in Geneva, for which there are some high hopes on the part of some members. What is your take on the WTO work and the new rules that would be relevant here? Can you tell us anything, how much can you tell us about the current state of play in Geneva on some of the new rulemaking issues?
Well, thank you very much, Lee. I think I covered some of the developments in work on domestic regulation in my remarks earlier. To provide more details on e-commerce, also known as digital trade, I can safely say that the participating members aim to advance work as much as possible by MC12. They may not be able to conclude it, but they're expecting substantial development to the extent possible. They have achieved good progress so far as well, and on the plurilateral setting, and the participants have produced clean text for a number of provisions and stabilized a text on transparency. Participants also engaging on issues such as data flows, data localization, source code, and customs duty electron transmissions. Some of those are quite difficult, but they are very much willing to continue to work on these provisions. They anticipate that the outcome will facilitate cross-border electronic commerce and contribute to realizing the opportunities that digitalization offers for inclusive growth that benefit not only for big companies, but also for small and medium-sized enterprises. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador, I think we were both around at the WTO in 1998 when this started, and I think a recurring theme over the years has been, how e-commerce, we hope, will help SMEs. So that's not been lost on members, I don't think. We hear both trade people, we hear trade people and we hear other experts in services say that it seems as though sometimes policymakers don't give enough emphasis to services. Maybe it's not well understood by some of the trade people outside of the services community. How do you think we can encourage policymakers to give a higher priority, more emphasis to services trade and to services negotiations as well?
Thank you very much. Again, compared with several decades ago, like 1998, I think there has been a great improvement for the policymakers, politicians, business people in understanding concept of trading services and also importance of trading services. But we think we should do more. And I think the people attending this event, listening to these events, are the really people who can do that. And we'd like to encourage everyone to encourage the policymaker around you to demonstrate this is an important sector. And this is a very key sector for the recovery and creating resilience after the pandemic. So in this sense, this APEC roadmap and business advisory council activities, including this event, are very much important event, and a very good example here. And we'd like to encourage further to push these kind of things. And you have to really emphasize the importance of services, not just important services in a business, but actually the important services environment, which is created by the legal stability of international arena, like the GATS and also RTAs as well. But I think there are a lot of development in the particular APEC areas like TPP or RCEP, bilateral, and many of them include a very high level of rules and commitments of services. But I think if you want to have a really inclusive and good environment for doing business, because business is being done on a global basis, I think it is very important to upgrade the commitments and upgrade the rules of the WTO under the GATS. So I'd like to encourage to support the WTO activities And the Asia Pacific region is a very vital area, and the services playing not just services alone, but services playing a supporting role in manufacturing and making important part of global and regional value chain. So I think Asia Pacific region has the people, has the ability and the knowledge of promoting global services rules upgrading. Thank you so much.
Ambassador, I strongly agree that Asia Pacific region will be very important, especially because it's a time when the WTO needs supporters. It needs strong supporters. It also needs brokers to help reach the compromises that we need to reach to reform the system and to move forward in negotiations. And I thank you very much for your insights. I'm so glad you could be here today. You're the perfect person to be with us and in this event. And let me thank the organizers for inviting you as well. I would like now to introduce our next moderator. We have moderating the next two sessions, Jane Drake Brockman, who has a number of hats. The hat which is most important, in addition to her work with University of Adelaide, but most important for today, is Jane's hat as director and founder of the Australian Services Roundtable. This is the capacity in which we all know and love Jane and her work. So let me turn the floor over to Jane Drake Brockman.
Thank you, Lee, very much. And thank you also to Ambassador Uyama and for the two of you for what was an illuminating conversation, which along with Bernard Hoekman's remarks really segue nicely, I think, into this next session where we focus on the need to accelerate digital adaptation to hasten the post-pandemic business recovery. I want to thank you also for that wonderful call on all of the audience today to continue the work of championing this sector. It's not always easy and it does sometimes fall on deaf ears. So we're grateful for that support. Thank you very much. We also in this session are going to shift very firmly from our discussion yesterday, more firmly today, into the trade policy and trade negotiating arena. We're going to focus on trade in digitally enabled services and cross-border data flows. Can I ask that the screen sharing be removed, please? Thank you. It's causing trouble with interfering with my screen. I'm only sorry that at the very last minute, the Coalition of Services Industries in the United States was unable to moderate this session. And I will be doing my best on behalf of Christine Bliss to cover the topics that I know CSI had planned for this session. It's important for us to remember, before I introduce our speakers, that nearly every speaker yesterday did mention the importance of digital enablement. We heard a lot about the accelerated uptake of digital technologies to keep both B2B and B2C flows of goods up and running. And some speakers did also offer specific policy advice. And I'm going to invite all of our panelists in this session to bear some of that thinking in mind and take the opportunity, if they wish, to talk about, return to any of those recommendations. For example, yesterday we definitely heard from a couple of speakers, both Tom Harley of ABAC and Professor Kimura, about the importance of the WTO moratorium on customs duties on electronic transactions, the importance of this for innovation. We've had that message again now from Ambassador Uyama. We had a very strong call from Professor Kimura to avoid protectionist digital industrial policies, the importance of getting it right on data free flow with trust, the importance of getting it right on cybersecurity and privacy, He also talked about the inefficiency of digital services taxes, the need for competition policy enforcement. He talked about the future of work, actually, and the increased opportunities that digital services delivery are offering for employment in developing countries. And we had a further highlighting now from Ambassador Yama and Lee Tuthill of the importance not only of rulemaking, but also market access negotiation and via the WTO JSI on e-commerce. So I remind all the panelists of that background as we go into this discussion. Our first speaker is Barbara Navarro, Government Affairs and Public Policy with Google, based in Singapore. Barbara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jane. I hope everybody can hear me properly. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to ensure that I take, time in consideration here. Let me start my speech saying I'm going to try to connect the dots between digital transformation and economic recovery, and why it is important to unlock the full potential of cloud, and what is the role that the government has to play there through a cloud first approach. We can move to the next slide, please. Then I'm going to take 4 facts in consideration. None of these are going to sound new to you, but I want just to go through this. The first fact is we have seen how the pandemic, how COVID has been a driver of a rapid digital transformation. We have seen this from Google Cloud. We have seen how the government agencies, business, basically government institutions has really accelerated this digital transformation. It is, in fact, reasonable to understand or to think that pandemic and post-pandemic recovery will still bring an appetite to move into the cloud. And I can say from here that we are seeing this growing every day. Cloud computing, we are convinced that it's going to be foundational to the region's digital future, and foundational and critical for economic growth. Then if you take all these considerations in mind, or if you take all this as facts, digital transformation and the role of cloud, it is really essential, it is imperative that public policies place a greater emphasis on the use of the cloud to advance public sector benefits. And I don't know if the audience agrees with me or not, but I'm gonna go through why it is important, why the government should really establish a clear framework about cloud, and why this is gonna help to accelerate the digital transformation because of the role that cloud is playing on digital transformation. Then the first thing that I want to say that is not reflected in this slide is that the government is a role model for other business to move into the cloud. If the government moves into the cloud, other business will move into the cloud. And I want to highlight that as something that is critical for this digital transformation. But let me move into some of the benefits. Optimize infrastructure cost, the use of data, right? And how you can really be efficient and effective with the use of all the data that the government has that can be transferred into new business and new services. Security is playing a critical role in cloud, but in general in the digital economy. Then the capacity to host applications in a security way, but also benefit from an industry-leading security technology. You know, more and more we are seeing why cybersecurity is becoming so important, because we are moving all into a digital space, plus security threats are growing dramatically. Then cybersecurity is at the front and center of all the government's agenda right now. And of course, I mean, the capacity to basically use what you need. Then let me introduce, we can move to the next slide, the concept of a cloud-first principle approach. And I have divided this into 4 pillars that governments needs to take in consideration. And maybe we're thinking, okay, there is so many countries already that have a cloud-first principle approach. I will say yes and no. We are seeing a few, but we are seeing that there is a strong need to have a very clear framework, and ideally to see this framework escalating into a level that goes beyond a country, right? I mean, how APAC or ASEAN or other institutions and organizations can really take a cloud-first principle approach. Then 4 pillars, as I said, cloud needs to be trusted. I mean, and this, as I said, cybersecurity at the front and center, needs to be open, needs to be flexible, needs to be efficient, not only because it needs to be green, right? And we are talking a lot about sustainability. It's also because it needs to be efficient in terms of cost and needs to be smart. And I'm gonna go a little bit deeper into these 4 pillars and talk about principles. If we can move to the next slide. When we talk about a trusted cloud, we are talking about shared responsibility. We are saying that customers and cloud service providers need to share responsibility, from cloud service providers being responsible to protect and maintain the infrastructure and services that provide to the customers. And at the same time, customers need to be responsible for the applications and the content that they built on top of that infrastructure. Just to bring some examples when we talk about shared responsibility. International standards to support privacy and security. This is critical. This is something that so often we see countries developing their own international standards, which is a clear roadblock for the adoption of cloud. It's a clear roadblock for an accelerator of a digital transformation and as such economic recovery. Data classification. I mean, we see government saying public sector data, I need to protect it, all needs to be on premise, can't go to the cloud. Data localization needs to stay in country. But a proper data classification regime will allow the government to manage in a much more efficient way which data can go into the cloud. Top secret, secret, confidential, restricted, and classified data, all these classifications deserve different levels of protection. The 4th one, last but not least, cross-border data flow. I mean, I know that is a topic that we constantly talk about this. It is important. I'm very connected with data classification. Maybe the top secret data needs to stay in country. Maybe the top secret data needs to be stored on premise, but there is other data that it will benefit from cross-border data flow. Then this is what the principles are under trusted cloud. If we can move to the second slide. We have the open cloud. The open cloud, this is again critical. Interoperability, government, business needs to move their data from one cloud to the other with no problem. I mean, systems needs to talk the same language. Multi-cloud, government, business needs to be able to choose whatever is the cloud service provider that they want to use, and to make the most and to choose the best of each cloud service provider. It is critical to avoid vendor lock-in and concentration risk. Then these are principles under an open cloud. If we move to the next slide, we have an efficient cloud in 2 aspects. Sustainability. I mean, if we are all moving into the cloud, if it's going to be critical for digital transformation and economic recovery, let's ensure that it's sustainable, it's environmental. There is a sustainability from an environmental point of view. And this is key. This is something that the government needs to take in consideration. Cost efficiency from a cost, this is not related with sustainability, it's related with the need to have a cloud that is able to bring cost efficiency. Then the next one, very quickly, because I'm conscious about time, the intelligent cloud. There are two two very important topics here. One, the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning through the cloud. Let me bring an example that is we are seeing every day, that is the use, for example, of AI tools for anti-money laundering. This is finance sector, is critical for the finance sector, is critical for the finance regulators. Then it is important to create an environment that promotes AI and machine learning. Last one, upskilling training to support human intelligence. Again, in the agenda of all the governments, but this is again critical. And the last one, that is a recap of what I have said. I will start saying, can we move to the next slide, please? Cloud computing services, foundational for the region, digital future, and for the economic recovery growth. Imperative to have public policies that really promote the use of cloud. A cloud first principle approach will allow a greater acceleration of cloud adoption. Thank you very much.
Barbara, thank you. A very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions I'd personally like to pursue with you, but in the interest of time, I better give each speaker the floor first. And so we turn now to George Lever. He is the chief economist with the Santiago Chamber of Commerce in Chile, where he runs a digital research center. That sounds interesting, George. I think you have some slides. Will you screen share, or would you like the team to share them for you?
Thank you very much, Jane. I will share the slide from my computer.
Thank you.
Here it is. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to explain my points in a pretty bad English, but I will do my best. Well, in all the countries we have seen a strong digital transformation in the last 2 years because of the pandemics, of course. But I want to address some points, starting with this logic of the digital, the forced digital transformation that we have been doing in the last months. In this slide, you can see how the digital population has been growth in the last year, which is, of course, a very much speed related to the other measures of global population. No, the global population grows at a 1% rate in average, and in the case of social networks, which has been the main form of digital connection in our modern society, the growth is well, very rapid. If we analyze the situation of different digital industries or models supported by digital technologies, we have a picture which is very similar to what we can think. No, the industry of digital payments is a very strong industry because it supports all the transactional industries, digital or not, which has some kind of digital transactions. No, and the B2C commerce is another traditional relevant industry. The m-commerce, which is related, of course, to the total e-commerce also. And we have a number of more recent industries with sizes so much behind the other main industries. No, the e-learning industry, video games, video streaming, music streaming, etc., telemedicine. But if we take a moment to see the growth of these industries, the situation changes a lot. No, we have a strong growth in these industries because, well, all of them are in emerging phase of the growth, of course, but also because of the pandemics. No, we have been working entertainment, studying in digital means, no, which implies that we have a special situation in this last 2 years, no, related to how we handle all this necessity to be more digital in all the aspects. This is the situation of the retail industry last year. And we have separated the growth in the e-commerce venue and in the total retail sectors. And we see a common pattern across all the world. In the global arena, the growth of e-commerce was 14%. And in the case of the total retail, we have a contraction of 3%. In all the countries, we have similar situations. In some countries like Argentina and Chile, the growth of e-commerce was impressive, really impressive. And the contraction of the total retail was very relevant also. In the case of Chile, we have a near 4% contraction in retail, but if we don't have the growth of the e-commerce side, we will have a contraction of 10%. This is the relevance of the movement that we see last year in the case of the e-commerce. A lot of new customers across the world goes to e-commerce. We see a rapid development in the case of the supply side and in the demand side also. A number of companies also, a big number of new companies comes to e-commerce, and traditional companies, traditional small retailers did not have the opportunity to stay in physical locals, shops, and they must go to the e-commerce. In the case of Chile, the transformation was huge. If we compare the main drivers of this situation, well, we see in this chart the growth in the same indicator, the growth in the number of online shoppers, but in the other side, in the other axis, we have the severity of the confinement process in the countries by the quarantines, etc. And you can see that in the case of the most confinement countries, the growth in the e-commerce shoppers growth more rapidly. The case of Chile is the extreme situation, a lot of confinement and a lot of new customers in the e-commerce. And this happens not only in e-commerce, of course, in the education industry, in the health industry, in the work or labor markets, etc. In all these markets, we see the same situation. More confinement drives more digital growth in the use of the different means. We start in Chile with 33%. A third of all the users doing regularly online shopping, and we've finally stabilized the number in more than 80%, which is which drives the global penetration to very high levels because of their importance in the total, in the case of US, also in the total global transactions, no? But well, and we clearly can see how digital was more relevant last year, no? In the case of Chile, we have a similar situation. This was our original forecast for the e-commerce industry in our country, B2C, and we see this new chart, no? This new line reflecting the impact of the COVID. We made in a public, private and public effort, we made all years with Corfo, which is the local promoting business department in the Chilean government. We made a study of a digital transformation index. In 2019, the index was in 43 points from a total of 100 points. And we grew 7 points last year, which has been the most rapid growth in the history of this index. And if we analyze this index, the growth of the index, the main growth happens in digital adoption. In cultural change or organizational change, the growth was behind these figures, almost 10 points, just related to a new digital adoption. This means that companies adopt digital technologies or models, but didn't adopt at the same speed the transformation, the cultural transformation in these organizations. "41% of the Chilean companies said that they accelerate the transformational, the digital transformation because of the pandemics, which is as expected, but is a huge amount of the companies. What we conclude with Corfo in Chile is that we have a very rapid transformation, all both in the side of consumers and population in general, and in the business sector. No, but we have the problem that everybody's using digital, but just a few of the new entrants are able to transform this process in the short run in a really transformational process in terms of what we understand as a digital transformation. A digital transformation is not only making transactions or using technologies, it's also related to the maturity of the deep cultural transformation required to operate in sustainable ways these new environments. So we are trying with the help of the government to design new ways of make an educational effort with the companies and with the consumers also to give sustainability to this digital transformation process. We need to make the cultural process to be coherent with all this adoption of digital means. So we think that the key point now and where all the efforts will be directed is to promote the digital cultural transformation. So we will keep using technology when we will back fully to the physical arena, no, which is happening right now in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. As you say, if the question is how to keep this going, because there's no going back, we're going to need to start looking at the policy environment that's conducive to that, which I know is also part of your work. I found it very interesting, this story on audio visual and video gaming animation. I mean, this sector has come from nowhere in Chile and is now a big export growth sector, and particularly I'm not sure whether that's all B2C or whether there's some B2B aspect of that, but it is a clear development in e-commerce, in services, digital delivery of services. So we'll come back to you, George, for some follow-up, but I will turn first to Louis Tay. Louis is the Chief Operating Officer of Playtech Holdings and a proud member of the Malaysian Services Providers Federation. I'm glad to see he displays that banner. I want to just say, Louis, that you're actually from my personal favorite of the services sectors, the engineering profession. And I especially like construction engineering and architecture because you can actually visually display your outputs in the built environment, which is a real luxury. Many services have trouble visually showcasing their expertise and their solutions, and engineers are good at explaining what digital enablement actually looks like in practice and how it impacts on business models. So over to you.
Okay, hi, thank you, Jane. Greeting to everyone. Let me share my screen. Hi, I'm Louis Tay from MSPC, Malaysian Service Provider Confederations. I will be following up on this topic with a little bit focus on what the MSPC has been working intensively over the last 2 years in Malaysia. We have been targeting the professional service industry, which especially the construction and the engineering fraternity, and we are trying to promote digital transformation, and ultimately the value should be integrated digital delivery. We like to share a little bit of what we have been advocating here. Of course, we all know that digital transformation will involve the technology, data. I think Barbara talked very well about data is not only about management, you also need to promote cloud usage, and people need to close the gap of competency. And the most important thing, a lot of people do not aware that digital transformation actually has a lot to do with process transformation. That we are no more talking about digitization, we are talking about digitalization. So what's the difference? It's actually, when we say that digitalization, you actually need to transform, digitalize both the work content and the work process. So if people who are in the construction industry, they all know about this latest report and survey by McKinsey, which was published last year at the height of the pandemic. And this is the future of the industry we're anticipating. It is quite a long report. We just abstract a part of it. And what is interesting is, compared to another report on the construction industry they have produced 5 years ago, there is a word they use in the early 5 years ago. They used the word digitization, and in this report they actually changed the word to digitalizations. And this report actually look at the value chain processes a lot. I think that's very important. We talk a lot about adoption of BIM and whatever software, cloud usage for common data environment. But what is this all about? It is all about, at the end of the day, creating new value, new economic value, and it will disrupt the entire process. And the outcomes are here. I think this report is accessible to everyone, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. So what I want to share is when we talk about BIM theory, we talk about digitalizations, we are talking about the solution to the root cause of this phenomenon that has been challenging the construction industry for ages. And what are the challenges? Okay. We know that the industry is one of those that highly not transparent, we call it, the opaqueness is really of question, and it is a highly fragmented industry. Value chains are fragmented, and it's the least, construction industry as a whole is the least digitalized industry. I think we are just doing a little bit better than the hunting industry as compared to everything else. Even the agriculture is doing better. And this is the fact about it. This is in Malaysia, our all service sector, Malaysia, the construction industry is the lowest in terms of productivity performance every year. Every year, we are about 50% of the national average. That's how serious it is. And I think from the speakers yesterday's, we have seen also that during the pandemic, construction is one of the worst hit or impacted sector of all. And frankly, as compared to the way we manage information and manage data, if we compare this to banking industry, we are like at the level of 30 years ago, what the banking industry do. You do not have real time, we do not have collectively collaborated working environment at all. And unfortunately, construction industry also follow the communication, the orientations of the value chains, the workflow actually follow the complication of contractual manner, the contractual orientation of projects. But it doesn't have to be so. In fact, informations can follow a different orientation, and because to digitalize the industry, you need to reorientate how information flow and communication is managed. We need to have a data-centric working manner. So this new way of collaborated collectively, real time on single source of truth SST is actually what we are looking for, what we need to make it happen for the engineering fraternity. And this is a little bit old, where we have been talking about this since last 2 years. We are saying that the IDD driving digitalization to achieve integrated digital delivery is the ultimate value we are looking for. And in fact, at this moment, it will value add to the service. It is value adding, playing the role of value adding, in my opinion, because it is not matured. But bear in mind, in my opinion, when this become matured, when your client enjoy this value, I believe in the future is this value will be equally important as your professional service value itself. So the digital delivery integration value is as important as the service itself. So traditionally, when we look at architecture engineering, we are looking at a service that to provide compliance to achieve serviceability. But today with IDD, you need to help to study constructability and maintainability with the intelligence of the software, with the automation of processes. And all these projects are talking about creation focus, how to create this, create that. And with IDD, we should look at sustainability focus. We look at the larger life cycle of built asset beyond it is constructed, how it is maintained, how it is managed. And also the traditional approach is very much work content focused, design values we talk about. Today, we need to look at work process enhancement, productivity value. And with IDD, we look beyond contractual linkage or value chains. We look at digital linkage. And in fact, it all has to start with the fact that we need to add a layer of digital information management system over this traditional approach. So these are the important value. And when we adopt this and achieve this, a lot of people is asking me what is BIM. BIM is actually an operational technology. Okay, and so at the end of the day, what we do when we achieve IDD is we have created a digital twin that is required to define the hardware of IoT functions. So not only aircon, CCTV that you're going to put in IoT, to make the whole system smart and integrated, we need to digitalize and create the digital twin of our built asset. This is essential. And when this is achieved, there are a lot of new opportunity of services, new startups will be there. And I just want to show this a transition theory. And it simply says that you want to start something. This graph tells you one thing, look at the blue dotted line. If you want to start transforming, you have to go through a challenge, the transition period. But I always say that when you look at this graph, what is important to understand is you have to start when you are above the blue line. It means when you are still healthy, however, you're no more productive, you're lesser and lesser competitive, it is time to transform. And so this is a message from here. And what we recommend, okay, we are saying that we call on to governments to create these collaborations, to empower this collectively real-time and this communication, work progress, and content on CDE and single source of truth. This will mean that, like what Barbara said, the government should encourage the cloud use. You should actually facilitate this cloud use, invest in this cloud, so that to create the entire infrastructure and database for the built asset of the country, that will create a lot of new economy. And second thing we talk about is, we always say that it has to standardize built asset information management strategically based on ISO. And of course, investment and leading the way is also important. So lastly, I would like to share, okay, because of my time is running, I would like to share something within my organization. My business happened to be in construction and engineering service. We have 3 different segments of business. And the digitalization, which is by the name of BEST, the company name, is the smallest of all. And this is how we grow through the pandemic, benchmarking on the quarterly average revenue of 2019, taking that as a benchmark. And you can see how we grow, how it will impacted, okay, especially our construction service, which we rent equipment and we do solutions. Building material is traditional trading, and we have 2 times of lockdown in Malaysia, and it's actually reflected in the 2, the valley that in the graph. But if you look at the recent towards this year, the first 3 quarters of this year, our digitalization services is actually doing much better than all the year before. It's only a 5 years business. And in fact, until the 3rd quarter, we are still in the dip. But based on the latest information that the business in October, we actually know that is into the recovery. So we expect it to pick up, all the business to pick up in the 4th quarter. But this is indicative that it is a business that people go for now. It is a service that is actually very much in need. Needed in the market. So that will conclude my speech. Sorry to take a bit too long. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, you've made it quite clear that for the construction industry, it is absolutely time to transform right now. Yeah. And I mean, your revenue figure at the end made that pretty clear where the future growth lies. I was very happy that you put up a policy recommendation slide and that you focused on a couple of things we haven't yet touched on. For example, the importance of standards, and in particular international standards and ISO standards, which is fundamentally important in digital transformation. And unfortunately, we're very behind in the process of developing the digital standards we need. Louis, we may not have time to come back to you, so I'm going to ask you a quick question before we leave you and move on to Deborah. We tend to think in the services sector that the big drivers of competitiveness at business level are access to talent and access to data, and you've made it quite clear that business must be data-centric. And in the engineering profession, as in all the professions, we've tended in the past to think more about the talent rather than the data and the people mobility side. So just a quick question, looking at data and talent, how do these stack up for you at the moment?
Yeah, I understand your question. Is managing data and talent is actually the whole content of our digital business, frankly speaking, nowadays. And to do this digital business that we are running, we actually have it. We have stuff not only in Malaysia, we have it everywhere. So the mobility of people is important, and because of this lockdown, they can't fly in, we can't fly it out. And we are having challenge with this at the moment. And when it comes to data, this is an interesting one. Okay? For example, in our country, we tend to want to drive digitalizations by getting people to start on the tools and sponsor, give training to buy the software. But what is more important that I see is if we were to decide a standard to follow and actually facilitate the cloud usage and create that build environment digital twin image in the cloud that is accessible for others to create new applications, software, that is more important. That is much more important than just getting people on the trend. If that end is there, the data linkage and connection is already there. The establishment of the data infrastructure is what we want to do, the value of the whole economy. So I think the government need to see that, having that, and whether you allow that, that is your wealth. At the end of the day, that will be a nation's wealth, whether you have that digital data.
Thank you very much, Louis. It's very interesting coming from one of the professional services where in the past we've had a very different story around priorities. So one of our panelists has in fact been lucky enough to fly in and fly out and actually attend a face-to-face event. So Deborah Elms, she is the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center based in Singapore, although I gather she's currently in Dubai. Like George, she works very closely with SMEs across both goods and services sector. Deborah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I am going to talk about the importance of digital services, which I think do matter, but we shouldn't forget the not digital services. And I'm sitting here in Dubai, I'm literally looking out the window at the courtyard of Expo 2020. where we have had, I think, at least 5 different musical groups come and perform while this panel has been underway. So while I think digital matters, and I would love to have you all see the digital version of this, there's also something to be said for doing it in person and being able to actually see people performing and singing. And at this expo, actually, I'm pretty sure that all of the APEC economies have pavilions, and you can go visit them and you can eat the food from various locations, and you can go shopping in all the little shops that they have at many of these pavilions. And this is an experience that I think, you know, represents in some ways the sort of best of services, you know, travel, tourism, hospitality, hotels, conferences, consulting, etc. I mean, I think all of those services are crucial. And when you haven't had them for a long time, this is my first trip in almost 2 years, then you really appreciate them perhaps even more. Although, please, I don't want to do this again. I don't want to do another 2-year lockdown. So let me go ahead and get into my presentation, and hopefully someone can pull up the slides quickly. I'm going to go through these quite rapidly because I know we are late on time, but I just want to say that, you know, one of the ways that we are going to get through this disruption is precisely to use digital trade and e-commerce. The next slide. The next slide, please. And I want to highlight again that digital trade is not just about e-commerce, trade in goods. And somehow we seem to focus a lot on trade in goods, which, you know, again, I can see the importance of trade in goods. But we need to remember that when we talk about digital trade, it's trade in goods, it's trade in services, it's telecommunications, it's financial services, it's investment rules, data rules, of course, adjustments in intellectual property rights rules to take into account the digital space. It's about consumer protection in the online space. It's about helping out micro, small, and medium enterprises who are really living and dying more than ever before through the use of digital tools. It's about capacity building, training, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that go into digital trade, and it needs to be effectively managed. And for me, one of the key measures or the key objectives of the trade, especially digital trade, is to allow the micro multinational to begin to sell goods and especially services from anywhere to anywhere. And so that's been the big promise of the internet age. COVID accelerated why that matters. But if we can't create rules that allow that micro multinational to sit in their living room or wherever they happen to be and engage in global commerce, I think we're really missing out on a huge amount of growth potential. And crucially for me as well, damaging the prospects for our smallest firms. And since all of the APEC economies are dominated by micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, if we can't make trade work for those smaller firms, then we can't make trade work for anyone. So I think this is especially important. The next slide just highlights the importance again of COVID. We all, of course, are keenly aware, sometimes sadly too keenly aware, of what COVID has done to all of us. And I would just highlight again, it doesn't eliminate the drive or the stampede toward delivery of goods and services. Doesn't mean that the offline delivery ends. There's a lot of things that are obviously going to be important. You all can't experience this expo if you're not actually here. So there's a lot of things like that. But we do need to reflect more carefully, I think, about the importance of online trade. Government, I can't emphasize this enough, government does not need to do it all. You don't need to make marketplaces yourselves. You're likely to make a hash of it. Don't go there. Instead, what you want to do is focus on making the policy environment and the policy framework as supportive as possible, and crucially, as I'll talk about in a second, as consistent as possible. And then you let business get on with doing business in the online world. So you don't have to solve all of the problems of the digital economy as government officials, but you need to set in place the right regulatory and policy frameworks, hopefully, thank you, APEC, in a consistent way across 21 member economies within APEC. That makes a big difference for companies. Next one. Sorry, next slide. There is a long time we've had digital trade that has flourished without any in particular regulations, or at least without consistent regulations. And lots of governments will say to me, oh, but firms like that. They like having no rules. And I would say, no, actually, most firms really dislike no rules. No rules feels very high risk and high uncertainty. What firms really want are consistent rules. So they need to have rules that are similar in multiple jurisdictions in the digital space more than ever. Because when you're that micro multinational, you don't know where your things are going to be sold or bought. And so you need to have consistent rules. But what we're seeing now is increased regulatory fragmentation in different locations, different markets, different economies. We're getting incoherence, and incoherence benefits the largest companies. It's expensive for them and they don't like incoherence, but they are able to manage the way around it. The smaller firms, however, are really at a disadvantage when you have regulatory inconsistency. Because you can't then navigate between these different markets. So if someone is on your website or your Instagram account and they buy something from you, either a service or a good, or download a song that you just performed out in the courtyard, if the rules are not consistent and you're small, then you're likely to get caught off by having, you can't sell, you can't get paid, all sorts of things are possible. So we want to have some consistency. So how do we do that? Well, one way that many Asian economies, including many of those in APEC, are using is to anchor many of these digital commitments into trade agreements. So they either create elements of digital trade or e-commerce within existing FTAs, existing trade agreements, or they create standalone digital-only agreements. And I'm going to talk about these very, very briefly because I know I'm short on time. Next slide. So there's lots of ways to do this. I'm just highlighting a few of them that are relevant for APEC. One that I want to highlight, particularly given New Zealand's excellent leadership at APEC, is the ANZFTA, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, which has been around with an e-commerce chapter that's actually very forward-leaning since 2010. There are lots of other kinds of agreements in the region. ASEAN and RCEP, of course, have some digital rules in them. They're not as great as I'd like them to be, especially RCEP, but what can you do? JSI has already been mentioned. The CPTPP has a lot of digital rules. And now we have some new next generation sort of digital only agreements. And many of those are about to expand or are in the process of being expanded. Next one. The rules, though, are different. And I think, again, this is part of the fragmentation. I think it's useful to have consistent rules, of course, but there is the risk that as we create different kinds of digital trade rules, we create more fragmentation instead of more coherence. And we need to remember that digital trade is not just about that e-commerce chapter. If you're going to make a good trade agreement that deals with digital, it needs to enable e-commerce goods trade, like paperless trade. It needs to have e-signatures. It needs to have digital documentation. And it doesn't just need to say, have e-signatures. It needs to make sure that they're legally binding and that you can, in fact, exchange documents electronically. It needs to include a lot more focus, and I'm delighted that Jane is working on this in this event today, of services trade being digitally delivered, because this is a key growth area, and especially a key growth area for smaller firms. We have some specific sectoral commitments, and we need to think about rules around IP in particular to think about what does that look like in the digital space. The next one, next slide. I have a list here of lots of things that need to be included. Some of them I just mentioned, some of them less relevant perhaps to this conversation. But I think the key is that the range of topics that need to be addressed is not just trade in electronic goods, but also services and all of these other areas. And that involves a sort of comprehensive approach to managing digital and regular engagement with stakeholders. So I'm always delighted that APEC does a better job than almost any other organization at managing that gap between government officials and the business community. It's crucial in the digital space so that we're making rules and regulations that are appropriate for business, but that also makes sense to business. Otherwise, we can have this huge disconnect between what government thinks is happening and what firms are actually doing on the ground. Next slide. I'm actually going to skip through two of these, I think, but I'm just going to highlight that there's lots of different ways to achieve the outcome of having consistency. Many of them, as I mentioned, are present in many APEC economies, from having comprehensive trade agreements to having the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, which is a standalone modular agreement, to the Digital Economy Agreements, the DEAs, which are digital elements that are built into a free trade agreement. So there are lots of different ways to get the end result. And the end result that matters to me is that we have consistent approaches to the digital space. So I'm going to show the next one very briefly. You all can get these slides after the fact. Next slide. I just want to highlight, and it's too small for you to read now, you can read it later. There is some consistency forming across just these 3 agreements. I could have done this with more, but I thought, let me just show you that we are beginning to develop many of the standard provisions to a greater or lesser extent in different trade agreements. And I think that that is helpful in eliminating the potential for regulatory inconsistency. And again, you can look at this in more detail on your own, or you can check out the papers and information we have on our website at theasiantradecenter.org. Next slide. So what matters between them is a couple of things. One is, how old is the agreement? Old. Remember that in the digital space, you know, a year and a half ago is ancient. So in the digital space, older agreements like 10 years ago or more have less comprehensive commitments, and the newer agreements tend to be, not always, but tend to be more robust. Some of them are cooperation only elements, especially on new and evolving issues, but we have some sort of consistency. Plus, it depends on how close our economies are at working together, the level of trust, the level of economic synergies between them. So we can have different approaches to these. And again, as I mentioned, lots of different ways to get there. You can create your own FTA, you can create modernize an FTA, you can make a digital only agreement. And the goal at the end of the day, from my perspective, is to replicate as much as possible in different venues, similar and consistent kinds of rules. Next one. I just want to highlight, and I think this is my last slide, some of the issues that are important, but tend to be not recognized actually in many of these different trade settings, in part because they are, as the slide suggests, emerging. So one of them is, and this is not a new issue, but widening inequality in digital abilities, technologies, et cetera. The gap has always been there. We've talked a long time about the digital divide. But the digital divide is, in my view, not just about getting on the internet, but what can you do when you are on the internet? So you're already there. Technologies are starting to diverge. COVID accelerated that even more. And so I think that inequality issue is something that's important to think about. Some agreements have a section called electronic payments, but usually it's sort of, we should cooperate around this because it might be important. And I'm going to say to all of you on this call, it's not just nice to have, it's critically important. If you cannot get paid for your goods and services, then you cannot engage in cross-border trade. So we have got to make this a priority and not just a nice thing to have. Cross-border electronic payments is vital. A new problem that is emerging, that is something that APEC could potentially look at because it has a structure that might help, is the nexus between tax and trade, and in particular around value-added taxes for services trade in a cross-border setting. It's something that no one really looks at. It is becoming a looming problem, and I think it will cripple small businesses. So if we're not starting to have a dialogue between the tax folks and the trade folks, we run the risk of making it impossible for small businesses to engage in cross-border digital services trade, especially. We have issues around data or digital sovereignty. We're worried about what competition policies should make sense. Well, how do we apply traditional competition rules developed from, you know, the old days of railroads and oil to a digital economy space? And I think we have a real risk there of getting those rules wrong and strangling digital trade instead of trying to manage digital trade. So we need to think hard about that. Trade development in the digital space, I think, is also important because that is a key area, a key enabler of development. And if we don't get the rules right again, the potential for development in the long run is also damaged. And then we have all kinds of new technologies, some of which I mentioned earlier, that need to be addressed, and not just in a sort of like, we ought to cooperate on these things, but actually, what are we going to do when we cooperate? And lots of issues around distributed ledger or blockchain. And then finally, and this is the last point that I'll make, and I apologize for moving so quickly, but you can have the slides afterwards and always reach out to me if you want to. has to do with the speed in which this all evolves. I mean, the digital world timeframes are, well, their internet speed, as opposed to governments, which do not move internet speed. They move at, I don't know, glacial speed or something. And so that disconnect, which has always been bad, I think is getting worse and worse and worse. And so we need to have some way in which we can resolve many of these digital trade issues faster than governments are used to. If it takes a decade for you to come up with the right regulatory rules for today's technology, you will be 10 years out of date before you even start, go on the new rules. So I think that disconnect is widening and needs to be closed as much as possible. And that's tough, I know, for governments. It's why I think you need to encourage, and again, thank you for APEC for doing this, the constant interaction between government and business. Otherwise, those sort of, disconnect just gets worse. So let me stop with those emerging digital issues, and thank you all very much for listening to me talk about digital trade today. Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie. And I just would like to say, really, we're going to be 15 minutes over our time limit, and it does matter because we have speakers waiting in different parts of the world. So we're not going to be able to have a proper discussion amongst us. I had hoped to be able to ask about one issue in particular, and that is the e-commerce moratorium. If Barbara has half a minute, she could join me on this, but I just think perhaps I will just quickly handle it myself, because Debbie stressed the importance of not strangling digital trade, and Ambassador Oyama pointed out to us so absolutely clearly that in 4 or 5 weeks' time, a choice has to be made about the moratorium, and not extending that moratorium has the potential to strangle digital trade. And I do want to emphasize that, just because I know Christine Bliss would have wanted me to, as the original moderator of this panel. It's 2 years ago that she and I went together with Devi Aryani from the Indonesian Services Dialogue, and we ran a session in Geneva on this topic, and thanks to Thailand championing it through the General Council at that time, we got another extension. But really, does industry have to turn up in Geneva every 2 years? Businesses can't operate like this. A 2-year time horizon is not long enough for business predictability. Barbara, I don't know, do you want to add something?
I will very quickly say that we think that extending the moratorium is critical for supporting digital economic growth, continue supporting that, to support innovation with no additional cost. And also I want to highlight that it is important also to take in consideration the digital divide impact that will have to lift the moratorium. Then, yeah, we are very supportive on extending the moratorium as it is right now.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you also to Debbie, because you helped address the question that is there in the chat function on what are we doing about digital divide, about equality, human rights, social resilience, all of those non-trade social objectives we have. And what I would say for the person who has asked us that question is go back over the recording for yesterday and listen to the panel session on inclusiveness, because I think the answers to your question lie really in that panel, which was expertly handled, and we've run out of time, I'm afraid. So big thank you to all of the panelists. Clearly, we need APEC to provide more opportunities for business stakeholders to get together and talk about digital trade. So we look forward to next time. This issue is not going to go away, on the contrary. So thank you very much. I do have to wind up and introduce the next session. The next session is a session for boosting services competitiveness. And It's a short session, actually. It's shorter than the one we've just had. It's where we try to bring all these issues together across the public-private dialogue to look at what stakeholders think APEC should do about them all, how APEC might need to adjust its work on services competitiveness in order to get regional services trade back up and running on its underlying rapid growth path. So we have to jump straight into it. We've got John's slides up, please. We have a presentation from John Drummond, head of the services division in the OECD. He's worked very closely with the group on services throughout the services competitiveness roadmap implementation period. John, you have the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Jane, and thanks everybody for including the OECD in this dialogue. I'll bring my slides up in a second, but I just want to start by saying I'm always so happy to participate in APEC discussions because, you know, viewing things kind of from a global perspective at the OECD, quite frankly, I always find that the APEC services community really gets it when it comes to understanding the complexity of services, the need for a clear evidence base, and the challenges of domestic coordination on services trade policy. I think the fact that you even have an APEC services competitiveness roadmap proves this point. And what I'd like to do today is in order to ensure that your roadmap remains relevant going forward, I want to give 3 concrete suggestions on how you can advance your shared services agenda and boost services competitiveness post-pandemic through APEC initiatives, multilateral cooperation, and domestic action. So first of all, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen some great advances in data and evidence on services trade. This makes services less complex, less abstract, and maybe facilitates political focus on the issue. And I think APEC has led the way in this. For example, the Services Competitiveness Roadmap in 2016 included a mandate to develop an APEC index for measuring the services regulatory environment across APEC economies. And the deadline for that work was to do so by 2020. And remarkably, that deadline was met. I think the successful implementation of this mandate by the CTO, by the GOS, and by the technical group that oversaw the work helps to contribute to a better understanding of how the domestic regulatory environment impacts competitiveness, employment, equality, and economic growth in APEC economies. So your APEC pilot index so far covers 4 economies and 4 sectors. And importantly, the methodology used in APEC is compatible with ongoing work by the OECD, by the WTO, and by the World Bank. And your database is updated annually to ensure that it remains policy relevant in a changing policy environment. And as we were just talking about on digital trade, things change very quickly. And it's important that this information is kept up to date. From my point of view, a logical next step for you to consider would be to expand this pilot project to cover more services sectors and more APEC economies. I think this is very feasible in terms of a near-term objective because their underlying regulatory information already exists in OECD and WTO databases. So it's a low-cost, high-impact step that APEC economies can take now. And will put you in a better position to address services trade challenges in the future. Now, why is it so important to continue expanding the body of data and evidence on services trade in APEC? And it's quite clearly because it makes it possible to compare the regulatory environment for services trade across economies and to quantify the gains from multilateral cooperation and the downsides of cross-border red tape. Which leads me to my second suggestion. So the adoption and ambitious implementation of the WTO Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation at MC12 represents an unprecedented opportunity to reduce services trade costs for businesses and consumers in APEC economies. And let me show you one. Bring up a few slides. So here, if you're looking at this graph, this is in the OECD STRI database. Looks at over 100,000 laws and regulations, and here's how they break down between domestic regulation and market access and national treatment measures. This is using the same methodology and structure that's employed in the APEC and index. You can see that the domestic regulation measures in green constitute a sizable shift, and anything that can convert these domestic regulators from regulation measures from bottlenecks into global gateways that facilitate trade can significantly reduce trade costs. How much can they reduce trade costs? Well, we can compare current levels of services trade restrictions in APEC to what they would look like if the JSI was fully implemented. And this slide shows the magnitude of reduced services trade barriers across sectors. You can see that again, these are some significant changes and reductions in barriers. And we can even take it a little bit further to see the benefits more clearly. Here we're illustrating the corresponding reduction in services trade costs. This is an average of almost 7% reduction for APEC economies. And when we perform similar analysis for G20 countries, for example, the services trade cost savings are very similar. So we think that the findings are relevant across all potential participants. And finally, by putting this in the context of total trade value, we can calculate the overall trade cost savings. We get this by calculating ad valorem equivalents of services restrictions using structural gravity analysis. And what we find is that the total relief resulting from the cutback of regulatory costs for services exporters and importers could amount to around $75 billion among APEC economies. If you stretch that to participation, assuming all G20 countries, that number goes up to over $140 billion annually. This is in sectors such as transportation, financial services, telecommunications, and business services. And from there, there's follow-on gains in terms of competitiveness, productivity, and employment across the entire economy. And given that exporting to new markets involves navigation of procedural hurdles and compliance costs, we also find that small and medium-sized enterprises will be the first to gain from such reforms. In fact, some of the information that we've recently published calculates that SMEs would enjoy an additional 2 to 3% cost reduction advantage relative to large firms. Now, I'm going to share that recent publication in the chat, Jane, when I finish speaking. Now, this information and this kind of analysis would not have been possible a few years ago. So the third suggestion I want to make is to underline that this evidence shows the importance of taking an economy-wide, whole-of-government approach to services trade policy making. We can see that seemingly small horizontal restrictions, that those impacts are magnified across sectors. And sector-specific barriers can accumulate along the supply chain, adding to costs and undermining competitiveness. I think in the current context, very importantly, those kind of barriers and costs weaken the potential for strong COVID recovery. So your APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap and complementary work by the OECD and other international organizations provides the tools to adopt these kind of approaches. So if you haven't seen it, I would recommend anybody who has not, check out Australia's recent Services Export Action Plan. From the point of view of the OECD, this is an excellent case study of how to mobilize a whole-of-government approach for services competitiveness. So I'm going to wrap up there, Jane. I'll try to give 3 concrete suggestions for both the business community and APEC economies to consider going forward. I think, first of all, expanding the APEC index on measuring the regulatory environment for services to all APEC economies and as many sectors as possible is an important step. Working together to adopt and implement the joint initiative on services domestic regulations is an unprecedented opportunity. And if you're still undecided about whether you should join this initiative or not, I hope the evidence of a 6 to 8% reduction in services trade costs and potentially billions of dollars of annual savings for exporters and consumers can help to get anybody who may be undecided off the fence. And finally, working domestically to think about a whole of government approach to services trade competitiveness is absolutely essential to ensure that your economy remains competitive in the 21st century. From my point of view, those are the keys to boosting services trade, to strengthening the multilateral trading system, and to promoting a strong, sustainable, and inclusive economic recovery. And I really commend the APEC services community for working so hard towards that goal. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. And nice to have it all sort of pared down to three things, because three things we can all probably remember. And you know, whole of government policy approach, actually having a strategy, obviously having a strategy, no silos, clearly does help bringing all the different elements into alignment. That was a very clear message, I think. Thank you. And we knew before you spoke today that your recent work showed that the WTO Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation had the potential to cut services trade costs by about 6 or 7%. And in fact, in our opening session on day one yesterday, Thomas Alcantara from ABAP Philippines stressed the importance of bringing trade costs down, especially those associated with regulatory inefficiencies. But what we didn't know is that we could put a number on it, $75 billion. Well, none of the businesses in this audience are going to forget that, because it's business that pays that price. So if we have time, we'll come back to you, John. But meanwhile, we have a message from Vangelis Vitalis, the New Zealand chair of APEC senior officials for 2021. So let's listen.
My name is Vangelis Vitalis. I'm the New Zealand APEC SOM chair for this, our host year. And I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to deliver these remarks. And I want to apologise for having to do this in a pre-recorded way. But the day on which you will be watching me give these remarks is the day that I will actually be in an airplane joining my minister on one of his visits. I did, however, want to take up this invitation because what you are doing and this public-private dialogue on services is so critically important for our region. Let me step back a moment and give you a sense of the context that we're operating in at present. Ever since November, since we took up the hosting of APEC, 100,000 new COVID infections a day. 1 million people have died. It is difficult to overstate how devastating this pandemic has been and how catastrophic it has been for our economic prospects across the region. GDP contraction across the region has been in excess of between 2 and 4% across the region. We've never seen anything like that. While trade flows are gradually beginning to pick up, services remains an outlier. If you think about the collapse in tourism, transportation, and of course education services, that significant contraction is one of the big confronting challenges that we face. Because if we are going to come through this pandemic, and if we are going to position ourselves well as a region and as an institution, as an organization of the 21 of us in APEC, services play a critical role. You all know the data. Services are a key driver of productivity, of competition, of innovation, of knowledge transfer, and you are a critical enabler of economic growth. Unfortunately, APEC, which has had a stellar record until recently, is starting to fall behind. Colleagues, it's easy to forget that our region, the 21 of us, account for nearly 50% of global trade and services flows. And there was a time when we were the leaders by a significant margin. I'm sorry to say, however, that over the last 3 years, we have actually lost our first place position. And I think there are some real warning signals there that we need to grapple with. And APEC is the ideal place in which to have that conversation about what it is that we need to challenge ourselves to deal with. The APEC competitiveness, the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap is a fantastic opportunity and tool by which we can diagnose some of the big existing challenges that confront us in the region if we are to get that growth out of the services sector. I want to particularly pay attention to the fact that some of the domestic regulatory hurdles that we are putting in place, that we are increasing as a consequence of COVID, some for good health-based reasons, but others that appear to be largely driven by protectionist impulses. These are the things we need to together lean in against and remind colleagues across the 21 of us that all of us need to pull in the right direction for that to become up. And if there's one lesson we've learned from the last 2 decades, it is that the next 2 decades needs to free up that movement among us. These are big, challenging issues that we need to grapple with in the services sector. And I'm pleased to say that in this, our host year, we have had a strong focus on the way in which services can enable the response to the pandemic. It is no coincidence that trade ministers attached to their statement a separate standalone commitment to look at the way in which transportation and other essential services supplies could be made to work to deliver vaccines and essential goods across our region. There is a good understanding amongst us all that in order for us to be fully safe and to be able to resume the kind of travel that we all understand is necessary to deliver the services trade that you are all working in, that we need to make sure that we are vaccinated, that we are protected. And this was a clear message that leaders were able to send when my Prime Minister chaired the informal leaders meeting recently. It was that powerful message, first of all, that vaccinations and responding to the pandemic were a crucial part of our DNA in terms of how we're going to get ourselves out of this crisis. But the second important message out of both that meeting and the Trade Ministers meeting is that the trade and services sector needs to contribute, can contribute, and the way in which all 21 economies need to be thinking about this is the opportunity that this provides for all of us to drive the productivity we're going to need if we're going to be able to respond to the crisis in front of us and position us well for the recovery. Colleagues, thank you very much. Really looking forward to hearing the outcomes of your public-private dialogue in this really important sector in this critically important year. My thanks to you all again. As I said, we do have a confronting challenge. It is not good enough that our region is starting to fall behind the rest of the world. We can change that. We must change that. I leave it in your capable hands.
Well, okay, there were lots of takeaways, I think, from that presentation. But there's one sentence that really rings in my mind. Vangelis Vitalis threw us all a challenge. We all need to lean in against protectionist impulses. I think that's an important message for us all to absorb. And as we absorb it all, I'm going to turn to Priyuprey Chumrun. She's the Executive Director of the Bureau of Trade and Services Negotiations in Thailand's Ministry of Commerce. Ms. Priyuprey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, John, also for the comprehensive presentations. I think we heard a lot of takeaways from some leaders from New Zealand. First of all, I would like to thank the Philippines ABAC for the invitation extended to me and the opportunity to participate in this dialogue. We heard a lot about the contributions of services sector to the GDP. I think we see the average of the developed countries like 75%. In Thailand, it's just like 60 and it's gradually increased, but actually we are expecting more. Trade and services, we can see that the COVID-19, the impact is really unexpected. And actually we can see that like mode 2, like consumptions abroad and also mode 4, movement national persons, badly hit by the restrictions or the response measures taken by the government. But in case of Thailand, we see that Mode 3, the commercial presence, the investment can be conducted, not really affected. We can see that it decreased maybe like 11%, but it's not really substantial like the movement of person. But the Mode 1, cross-border services is substantially, incredibly increased. And we heard a lot about the previous presentations as well as speakers about the importance of digitalizations and the opportunities arising from the cross-border services. But having said that, we have to thinking about what is really needed in terms of because I'm from the government as well, I'd like to say that in terms of government's actions or the roles of government, it's very clear that we need to have the sound environment for the digital economy. But in the same time, we're talking about the domestic regulations that would enable the services supplied and also reduce the cost of trade. But when we're thinking about talking about how the services impact from COVID-19, I can say actually previous speaker, the New Zealand SOMS has already mentioned clearly about the tourism sector. You can see that Thailand have heavily rely on services, which is a traditional services tourism sector. This really, we have a lot of tourism, like 40 million a year. And then we have the COVID with the stagnations of the transportations, the logistics and everything. So actually these sectors are heavily badly affected from the COVID-19. But still, we see the e-commerce services brings opportunities and increase a lot of trade opportunities, reduce trade costs, and also extend it to the SME. But again, when we're talking about the benefits of the e-commerce platform, again, we have to, there's pros and cons. And actually there's a previous speaker, I think from ATC, mentions about the digital divide. Not all can access, not all operators or not all entrepreneurs can transform themselves. So actually, we need to see as well how to assist them, how to help them onboard or access to necessary facilities. When talking about digitalizations, I think we need to how the digital technologies can help us to integrate into the global value chains. We see previous speaker as well about the many opportunities about taking IoT to integrate themselves in the services, and also like constructions, engineers. We also see that opportunities as well. But again, digitalizations may give opportunities, but in the same time, for those who cannot access, may also increase the inequality across the economy. But having said that, I would say that digitalizations alone, even the government supports or the idea of transform entrepreneurs or companies to become digital or adopt digital technologies may be not sufficient. We need also domestic regulatory reforms. I think previous, some already mentions about the efforts of APEC and also the effort that we have under the WTO Joint Initiative. I think Thailand, we also see and recognize the importance of the digitalizations and domestic regulations. That's why we joined the JSI e-commerce and also the JI domestic regulations. But having said that, I would say that the domestic regulations is very important for the services supplier, because they need transparent rules. They need to see what is the procedures and the timelines, and also sometimes they need to engage in the procedures. And also they need some notifications. They need their business to be, predictable. I would say that in case of Thailand, we have done all these digitalizations, because in the national strategies, we also have digital economies in the national strategies for quite some time. That's why we have legal frameworks for that's like Deborah mentions about the laws. When you transform yourself to digital, the thing is people mentions about business needs predictability. And I think it's very important to have the infrastructure, both physical, of course, you need digital infrastructure for the business, and also the soft infrastructure, which is the legal frameworks. The frameworks for recognitions of the e-signatures, e-invoicings, e-contracts, or the consumer protections, which is online consumer protections, the cybersecurity laws. Don't forget that when you enter into digital economy, there will be pros and cons as well. The benefits for the business, the benefits for the business, for the entrepreneurs, but in the same time, the consumer, how to protect them from the fraud or any something went wrong, something like that. So the law would help them to have more confidence and can reap the benefits of the digital economy. When we're talking about service sector, service certifications in process in Thailand, as I mentioned earlier, we heavily rely on the traditional services like tourism. But now I think the government have been reviews and try to move into the modern services. We heard today, we heard about the modern activities. Actually, there's potential services that Thailand is looking at, like tech finance or research and developments or medical and wellness services, which is very quite outstanding in Thailand. So we think it's amidst of the COVID-19 is also opportunities for the countries to review the policies that should adjust to the challenge and also to reap the benefits of the opportunities. I think that's all from Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some strong messages there on both domestic regulation and on digitalization. I will come back to you shortly, but I do want to emphasize something you said, which is that, yes, most economies have national digital strategies in place now and have had for some time, and they tend to focus on ICT infrastructure, on digital skills development and on the regulatory needs. But I think, as our previous panel made clear, if we all keep working on those regulations without any understanding of the international or trade aspect to all of this, we risk fragmenting that digital market rather than cooperating to ensure interoperability, which is the fundamental thing we need for digital trade to really prosper. So some very important issues there for us to think about, and the importance of asserting the trade principles in these strategies, I think. But we must absolutely now hear from the business community. Perhaps we can have the slides up, please, as I turn to Mr. Ho Meng Kit of ABAC Singapore. He really needs no introduction at all. He is the very well-known, long-serving chair of the ABAC Group on regional economic integration. And I invite him, please, to give us ABAC's conclusions on how well APEC is travelling on services competitiveness and what ABAC thinks APEC should do about it going forward.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody. And in view of the time, I thought if you can share the slides, we go straight to the ABAC recommendation, the last two slides. Next slide, please. Yes, this one. Well, thank you, Jane, for helping ABAC, especially the ABAC Services Task Force, to come up with the businesses' inputs to the competitiveness roadmap. This was submitted to GOST in May this year, and Jane helped tremendously and in May this year. And the recommendations, they were very comprehensive. We had 40 recommendations and eight new initiatives. I think if I may, Jane, sort of summarize, I hope you won't be offended if it's such a comprehensive document, but I thought there are at least 6 important points I want to bring up. But overall, I think the message that we are sending to the APAC official is that it's just like the same message that the SOM chair the New Zealand SOM chair has said, that the progress is mixed. We have not fallen behind. We've fallen behind in terms of the target, but we feel that the roadmap is a worthy framework, and with some policy adjustments and refocusing on priorities, especially post-pandemic, APAC can stay on track of this roadmap. So, I mean, that was our general conclusion. I personally felt that there were 6 sort of key recommendations that stood out particularly for me. First of all, I felt that in the area of services, we need to focus a lot more on structural reform and behind the border improvement. For trades in goods, we focus a lot on trade facilitation, but for services, I think the various APAC fora, whether it is GOS, whether the structural reform ministers, really we need to talk a lot more about structural reform behind the border, and especially the unilateral reform of individual countries. So countries do reform for their own domestic purposes and competitiveness as well. So this international, this individual action plan of countries is actually a very important component. So that's the first point. Focus more on regulatory policies and practice because it has effect on services. The second point is on digital services and e-commerce. I don't think I want to elaborate because I was listening to my colleague Deborah from Dubai, and she made such an excellent presentation. I think we all know about why digital is important. In fact, today there was a survey done by WEF in collaboration with Sea, the e-commerce company in Singapore, and they interviewed 86,000 Asian youth in 6 ASEAN countries, and 87%, and some of these youth run as MSMEs, 87% of the MSME survey felt that post-pandemic, digital is the way to grow. 87%. That means the young people, the young SMEs think that the way to go in the future is through digitalization. So we need to really get on with it. It is a big agenda. We're talking about not just about policies, we're talking about digital inclusion, better access to infrastructure, to devices. We're talking about skills and retraining, but it is not something that we cannot do in APAC. And I think we should do, and it would have a huge impact on services competitiveness. And there are frameworks, there are trade agreements, DIPA, DEA, to help us, to bring us along. So really the second point is focus a lot on digital services and e-commerce. The next one is particularly about what has happened post-pandemic is this sector, this tourism sector that has been massively it is really massacred. In Changi Airport, if you go to Changi Airport today, it's like a ghost town. We only have less than 5% of our traffic, But now we're opening up. But I think next year, and I think when countries are now become more vaccinated, when we, firm our policy of living with COVID, I think borders will begin to open and open safely. I think tourism will come back, but it needs to come back, as Deborah said, not in a haphazard way. It has to come back in a coherent way. Cross-border rules, recognition of digital certificates, all that needs to be put together for safe travel and border opening. It will have a tremendous impact on tourism and a knocked-on impact on many other tourism-related sectors in the services area in many APEC economies. So I felt that tourism we should do, and I'm actually looking forward to Thailand actually initiating this, because I know how important tourism is for your market. Next slide, please. The other recommendation I felt which was important is health. Now, as a result of the pandemic, people have tapped on e-health, regional services, and not only that, because of the pandemic, groups around the world has collaborated remotely to develop vaccines, to develop treatments for COVID-19. And I think this should be engendered going forward. We should preserve this going forward, because this is a powerful tool and cooperations that we have. And if we can do this on a regional basis, we can do two things. We can be better prepared for the next crisis, for the next big virus. And secondly, I think e-health services cross-border is actually an important services that can be, delivered to many more population in APEC economy. So I felt that exiting from a pandemic, health services is something that we should focus on. Third is that, because we are all locked down, we really could not have physical or many more public-private sector dialogue. And I think it is critical going forward for the services competitiveness, for us to have more public and private dialogue. And here I think we can focus it on not only on general policy, but on specific sectors. I've listed some sectors here. One is the environmental services, very important to get together, see how we can make it more competitive, because every country now is talking about green, is talking about sustainability, and we have a pool of competitive companies, environment services company, whether it is in mediation abatement services, or even our built environment services, which are competitive for building of infrastructure. So why don't we have a public sector dialogue there with the private sector, how to increase the competitiveness of this sector. Another two sectors is in the mining and technology sector. And yet another sector I could say is what I earlier said about, about digitalization, enabling actually MSME to be MNCs to go global. And these are, can be small companies in the creative space, audiovisual space, multimedia entertainment space. Why not get them in together in a B2B business networking event and actually try to leverage and link them to the global value chain? So I thought these are three suggestions that we have put up to the APEC officials. And lastly, we felt that in the roadmap, it's important for us to have more frequent and more transparent monitoring of the roadmap outcome. And one proposal that we put forward is, concentrating on the individual IAPs of economies, looking at the services dimension of the IAP. Why not have more frequent? We propose to have two, one in 2022 and one in 2024. Put businesses, put academia together in this IAP. And this is not just an occasion for review, but it's an occasion to get businesses inputs, academia's input, but also to celebrate success, mutual learning, and to celebrate success. So these are, to my mind, some of the important recommendations to me that we submitted to GOS. That's all I have, Jane. I hope you don't mind. I just do 6, though you have put in a whole list of recommendations to our GOS colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a very frank business assessment, and you did focus on a solid set of ideas for APEC's work program going forward. I couldn't agree with you more. And I really do think that what you've said deserves a considered government response. And so, of course, I'm going to put Prue Prey on notice that I'll come back to her on that. I think it is actually important to recognize that one of the issues that Menkit has called for, which is concerted action to open up a whole range of services sectors from ICT, logistics, transport, e-payments, computer services. This is precisely the set of sectors that John Drummond's work to measure the extent of regulation and the extent of opening up has identified are in need of more effort. And I think it's some of that work presented by the OECD has also shown us actually that Thailand, in the big effort it's made, as Prue Prey described, to make it, to free up and facilitate the supply of services, has been through domestic reform, including they really have brought their digital services trade restrictiveness index down. So the way I think we'll do this, I absolutely do have to shortcut for time. And so I think I'm really, the best way to do this is to ask first John whether he would like to leave any further additional message, anything he wants to emphasize in what he has said, and then another bite at the cherry from Menkit, any further thing he would wish to emphasize, and then I have a question for Prue Prey with which I'll end this session. So John, do you have any particular additional thing you would like to stress?
Thanks, Jane, and just some concluding remarks. So I started by saying how coming to APEC discussions is always invigorating, because I think this community and the people involved in this discussion get the importance of services. But then Vangelis kind of told us about how APEC was losing a bit its edge overall. And what my message to leave with you is that in the services competitiveness roadmap, in the work that you're doing, you have the tools and the capacity to regain that edge, to organize APEC economies for the 21st century, and so many common goals and objectives in the APEC way of working together and advancing these things thoughtfully and strategically. So the joint initiative on domestic regulation, some of the tools that are in your roadmap are at your disposal. And I think the strengthened evidence base that you have can help to focus minds from a political perspective to make sure that you capitalize on benefits that services trade holds for citizens of all APEC economies. Thanks, Jane.
Well, thank you very much, John. And Menkit, would you like to, is there something you want to say?
Yeah, just one point. It's on APEC's implementation of services. Right now, the competitiveness roadmap is cross fora. It doesn't have a lot of visibility, you know. So I thought if we can build in the services competitiveness into the Putrajaya vision document, I think there's a lot more visibility. Then there's top of mind. You need to get there. So that's my suggestion, because right now it's sort of a little bit under the radar, but we know how important services is.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is effectively give the last word to Prue Prey. Madam, you have about 2 minutes to respond to Menkit's outline of ABAC's business recommendations to APEC, and in particular, how you see the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap going forward as Thailand takes the chair for APEC 2022. And finally, because you're a services negotiator, and because in the last panel, Debbie Elms put a lot of data up on slides across many different recent agreements in the region, and she mentioned RCEP amongst them. And I just want to give you the opportunity, if you want to come back in on what we do in APEC about this sort of proliferation of FTAs that are out there dealing with these issues, and how we're going to handle all of that through the competitiveness roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Mr. May, for the presentations. As the host for APEC next year, Thailand is pleased to carry on with the initiative, and we would like to see the roadmap being reviewed and adjust to better reflect the current state of play of the trade and services, and also the challenges that we probably see, hope less and not more. And just to make sure that the roadmap continues to provide a strong framework for the development of services sector in the APEC region. With respect to the work of the ASER, I think we echo, most of the recommendations as Mr. Main just mentions, we should push forward unfinished business, like final push for services, removing the barriers of trade, particularly the area of the MSMEs participations, strengthen the abilities of the business towards mode 1, like cross-border services, and support accelerations of the digitalizations and services service certifications, and of course regulatory reforms to the domestic regulations. And I think it's also part of the APEC efforts to encourage APEC economies to join the JSI or the JI initiative under WTO, which is the JSI e-commerce and the JI for domestic regulations. I think the more participations, the more participants, the better. And with respect to what Deborah mentions, as James highly mentions earlier about the cross-cutting internationalization, so the e-commerce rules. And also in case of Thailand, we mentioned about the strategies and the reforms and the laws and the establishments of the legal frameworks in the countries. I would like to say that, as Jane mentioned earlier, it's very important to stick to the international baseline. For example, like the legal frameworks, you should looking at ancestral, for the electronic transactions, and also Thailand's also engaged like other ASEAN members. I think we engage in the ASEAN, we engage in APEC, we engage in FTA, we have ASEAN +1, like Deborah mentions, ASEAN New Zealand, and we also have RCEP. All these, we have the e-commerce chapter, we have the rules, but again, with those rules in the binding agreements, it's come to the enforcement of those rules. So it means that you need the readiness of the legal frameworks in the domestic is very important. And that domestic legal framework should be consistent with the international standards. And I think there's an APEC effort on these matters. It can be streamlined, domestic, regionals, multilaterals, initiative all together. That's APEC could contribute, and it's very important to have the initiative, the public-private dialogue more on this initiative. Thank you.
Well, that was a good point to end on. I couldn't agree more with that, because we simply cannot finish our agenda in the time frame we have. It's 1:30 in the morning for me. But the three of you have well and truly kept me awake. So thank you very much, Prue Prey, Chumron, John Drummond, and Homeng Kit. It was an excellent discussion, and thank you very, very much. And good luck for next year. My final task is to introduce our third keynote presentation and to pass the moderator's baton to Jason Lee of the Singapore Business Federation. Now, in a nutshell, this final session is about how governments can get it right for services industries, both locally and globally at the same time. This wonderful word, glocally. Our speaker is Jaime Kogi Arias. He's the Deputy Permanent Representative at the Costa Rica delegation to the WTO and coordinator of the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. Now, tonight he has the relatively rare good luck of being in a position to announce an outcome. In fact, Ambassador Uyama already told us at the beginning of this session that there is that you have concluded your work, and so we're keen to hear what you've got ready for WTO ministers to harvest if the political will can now be mustered. And as the team puts your slides up, or maybe Jaime, as you share screen, I want to say thank you to you, because you are no stranger to the Asia Pacific Services Coalition. You've devoted many hours to stakeholder outreach. You've kept us informed of where these negotiations were at. And you've met with us all before, including Jason there on the podium with you. But today is special, including as we all celebrate Singapore's decision of just a couple of weeks ago to join the initiative. So Jaime, over to you, and Jason then takes up the baton. Thank you.
I think, I don't know whether I should start with Jason's, who starts? Jason?
Yes, please, please start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jane, for this introduction, and Jason. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you today to give you an overview on the ongoing negotiations in the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, which I have the honor of coordinating. The initiative is looked as one of the WTO negotiating issues most promising for delivery by the next ministerial conference, which, as you will know, will take place at the end of November this year. In the coming 8 minutes, I would like to address these 3 main points. First, I would like to explain how the issue of services domestic regulation is addressed by the Joint Initiative, and in particular, how an initiative outcome on this topic will look like. Secondly, I would like to inform you about the current status of the negotiations. And finally, I will provide an outlook of the next steps that the initiative will take to arrive at the finalization of the negotiating process in time for the MC12. But let me pause for a second on what we concretely mean when we talk about services domestic regulation. For services business, and this is something that you know very well, who want to export abroad, it is sometimes challenging to find out about the requirements for obtaining a license, and often there is no one to turn to for requests for information, or when suppliers file their applications, there are at times left in the dark as to how long processing times will be, and by when they can expect approval of their application. And in some places, documentation requirements are excessive and burdensome, and still relying on paper rather than electronic means, original documents rather than certified copies. In a nutshell, what business had long been demanding are transparent, fit-for-purpose requirements and procedures which minimize the unintended consequences of regulations in services sectors. Now that we have clarified what are the problems that can be linked to domestic regulatory measures, let me move to the questions of how this issue is addressed specifically by the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. The disciplines on services domestic regulation developed by the initiative respond broadly to business needs expressed under the 3 pillars: transparency, legal certainty and predictability, and regulatory quality and qualifications. On transparency related matters, WTO members will be required to make available all information needed by business to comply with requirements and procedures for authorization, including on, for example, authorization fees, contact points, licensing criteria, and technical standards. And in addition, members will have to respond to inquiries by services suppliers through appropriate mechanisms. And finally, the disciplines aim to improve the involvement of suppliers in the regulatory decision-making process with a call for publication of draft laws and regulations and the establishment of opportunities for interested suppliers to comment on such proposed measures. Under the pillar of legal predictability and certainty, the objective of the discipline is to ensure minimum guarantees to be followed by relevant authorities during the licensing and authorization process. As you can see from the screen, this includes several elements such as indicative timeframes for processing applications or information on status and decisions on applications and the possibility to resubmit applications in case of rejection. And finally, the disciplines also aim to improve the regulatory quality of services markets and facilitate trading services, including by encouraging members to accept electronic applications and authenticated copies of documents, requiring the independence and impartiality of regulatory authorities when dealing with authorization applications, and the transparency and reasonability of authorization fees. The regulatory disciplines that the initiative has negotiated over the past 3 years are contained in the reference paper on services domestic regulation. What is important to note is that the reference paper provides for certain built-in flexibilities that aim to preserve space for differences in WTO's members' regulatory capacity and approaches to services regulation. I will come back to the reference paper and its content in a moment, but what I would like to highlight here is that the reference paper is only just one of the 2 main components of an initiative's outcome. To give concrete legal effect to the reference paper, participating members will inscribe it in the respective services schedules so that the disciplines on services domestic regulation will apply horizontally to all the sectors committed therein. This is indeed what our ministers had instructed us to do through the joint statement issued in Paris in May 2019. While taking stock of the great progress the initiative made in the previous years since its establishment, the participating members committed to continue work on services domestic regulation with a view to incorporating an outcome in the respective schedules of specific commitments by the MC12. Now that I described what form an outcome on services domestic regulation will take and what is the initiative's working objective, I would like to inform you about where the negotiations on the first component of the outcome, the reference paper, stand and what is in it. At the last initiatives meeting on 27 September, and thanks to the flexibility and pragmatism demonstrated by all participants, the initiative was able to resolve the remaining outstanding issues in the reference paper. So I'm very pleased to inform you that the negotiations on the text have now come to a conclusion. The reference paper on services domestic regulation is now available as an unrestricted document accessible to all on the WTO website. What you will see when you will skim through the reference paper is that it's composed of 3 main sections. On very important aspects I would like to focus on for a moment pertains to the flexibilities provided for developing country members participating in this initiative. First, developing economies can delay the application of specific provisions in sectors in which they face implementation difficulties. The use of transitional periods can aid them to make any necessary adjustments to their domestic regulatory frameworks. In addition, least developed countries deciding to join the initiative will integrate the disciplines into their GATT schedules only when they graduate from LDC status. And finally, developed and developing country members in a position to do so are encouraged to provide specific technical assistance and capacity building to developing and, in particular, LDC members upon their request and on mutually agreed terms and conditions. Sorry, I have a call. Now, as a last point in my presentation, I would like to inform you on the concrete next steps that the initiative will take to arrive at finalizing this negotiating process in time for the ministerial conference at the end of November. Based on the conclusion of the negotiations of the text reference paper, as coordinator of this initiative, I have suggested that the group works towards the preparation and submission of services schedules incorporating the disciplines on services domestic regulation by the end of October. Sorry. As I have just said, a package of schedule by participating members is a fundamental component of an outcome on services domestic regulation, because only through schedules the disciplines will be given legal effect. The ministerial conference itself will be an opportunity for the participating members to declare the conclusions of the negotiations, as well as to provide guidance for the start of certification process in 2022. At present, there are 65 members participating in this initiative, and they represent about 90% of the world services trade. Most recently, Singapore announced its decision to join the group, but as we rapidly approach the ministerial and the contours of an outcome on services domestic regulation become clearer and clearer, many other members have already indicated an interest in this process. Let me conclude on a few key messages. As you can see, the negotiations are substantively at a very advanced stage. Domestic regulation is, as I'm sure most of you have heard already, one of the most promising prospects for delivery by the MC12. The participants are convinced that an outcome on services domestic regulation is an outcome for business because services suppliers will be those who will benefit from the enhanced transparency, legal certainty, and predictability, and ultimately the greater regulatory quality and facilitation that the disciplines seek to establish. When they trade within markets of members who adopt the disciplines, services suppliers will all equally enjoy the benefits deriving from the implementation of these disciplines. What does it mean in practice? It means better access to services markets and new export opportunities. It is clear a result on services domestic regulation will have a concrete impact on the operations of service suppliers and the performance of services sectors, and for that reason constitute an important building block in the post-COVID economic recovery. I believe, and all the members' initiative do as well, an outcome on services domestic regulation will not only finally provide a long-time due response to business needs, but will also renew energy in the multilateral trading system and the WTO as a negotiating forum. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Jaime, for your presentation and very exciting news for our businesses in the services sector. I want to focus our short follow-up discussion on the Asia Pacific region today, which has seen the services sector increase its share of GDP to beyond 50%. This has been particularly so with the development of technologies that enabled and facilitated new modes of service supply. Over the past 2 years as well, the pandemic has seen ICT and logistics services gain increased importance as people and businesses relied increasingly on virtual interactions, digital communications, and deliveries. The good news is that the regulatory environment in Asia Pacific has become more trade facilitative in recent years. Based on the OECD Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, the APEC average has improved from 2014 when it was lower than the OECD average to 20% higher than the OECD average now. The 2018 APEC non-binding principles for domestic regulation of the services sector initiative have played a big part in this by establishing a set of core transparency principles that's influenced both domestic regulatory reform and negotiation process in the Asia Pacific region. So the former has resulted in greater convergence in domestic regulation rulemaking, while the latter has resulted in negotiators increasingly focus their attention on the regulatory aspects affecting trade, as opposed to the traditional market access approach. Despite that, the cost of trade is still significantly higher for services than in goods. So studies have shown that domestic regulation reforms could reduce trade costs by 7% for APEC economies. So in short, I could say we have come a long way, but there is still a long road ahead of us. The WTO GSI for services domestic regulation will be a huge milestone in this journey. And it's very heartening to hear the G20 trade minister's statement yesterday mentioned the support and of course your update as well. So I want to start my first question for you with Jaime, that you mentioned that the GSI has a support of 65 WTO members covering 90% of the world's trade services. Are you happy with this number, or are you getting more member economies in agreement? Are there any kind of specific region you're targeting?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this question. Well, I believe that this number, 90% of the world's trading services, represent true global reach. Nevertheless, the group is firmly committed to use the remaining time before the MC12 to convince more members of the benefits of joining this initiative. The initiative would like to get on board at least most, if not all, of the leading 50 services traders. And among those are several from the APEC region, like Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And I think most of these countries, as you have mentioned, should be able to join. They have undertaken broad regulatory reforms to make the domestic environment more conducive to business activities, and they already agreed to regulatory obligations equivalent to the disciplines developed by the joint initiative in the recent trade agreements. And in addition, as I highlighted in my presentation, let me emphasize that the initiative's reference paper is drafted in a very flexible manner. And in order to, in order to allow spaces for differences in regulatory capacities and approaches, and there's also flexibilities to assist developing countries in case they face challenges with the implementation. So I think it's not that we are I mean, we have a good number, 90%, but we are looking forward to bring on board more countries.
Indeed, Jaime. So I'm aware of the time as well. So maybe I'll just follow up with one further question for you. As we know, developed or high income members tend to have greater compliance with the GSI disciplines already. And of course, earlier you mentioned in your presentation that developing country members, particularly LDCs, will enjoy more flexibility with the agreement, so that will give them some form of assurance. But could you share how domestic regulatory reform can have a greater potential for developing countries or lower to middle income member economies, which may feel that their services companies may not be as efficient or as capable or with as much capital as those as their counterparts in developed members?
Well, we all know, and this, I think this is what this has being along an idea that has been along all this event, that how very important is for business operations that the requirements and procedures are clear, straightforward, and readily accessible. I come myself from a developing country, and for small economies like us, it is even more crucial to implement domestic reforms to enhance the transparency and predictability of laws and regulations, and to make the system more effective. Because if you want to attract investors and suppliers from abroad, you have to signal that your domestic environment is ready to host them and to make their life as easy as possible to conduct their business. But we also know that trade is more and more about services, and services today are critical to all economic activities. They generate more than 2/3 of economic output, attract over 2/3 of foreign direct investments, and provide most jobs globally, particularly for developing countries. Improving the quality of domestic services regulations is key to reducing cost of trading and reaping the full benefits of services liberalization.
Right. Thank you so much, Jaime, for your very insightful answers, and of course for driving this very important agreement forward at the WTO and keeping the business community engaged all the while in this. I'm aware that we are now 15 minutes over our time, so I'm going to hand over the time to Bill Las, a member of ABAC Philippines and Philippine Services Coalition, to close today's workshop. Bill is also a consultant to ILA Corporation and Chief Resilience Officer for the Philippines Disaster Resilience Foundation. Bill, the time over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Tomas Alcantara, Chairman of ABAC Philippines. Tom Harley, Convener of the Services Task Force. Ho Meng Kit, our Chairman at the ABAC REIWG. Assistant Secretary Eric Tamayo, our Deputy APEC SOM Head for the Philippines, and our fearless leader, Jane Drake Brockman. It's been a wide-ranging and full discussion over the last 2 days, and I will do my best to try to tie things up together and run a thread, I guess, through all our discussions. I think at the start, as Secretary Ramon Lopez opened, he says this was a good time to run this PPD on services, as this is the midterm review for the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap. And as Mankit mentioned, we've got some hits, we've got some misses, so we have mixed results, and it's a good time to look at where we are. And in the middle of this pandemic, what we've seen is that we've been affected, the services sector, but the whole economy really has been affected by a set of negative supply shocks, negative demand shocks. We've had worker shortages, material shortages, longer wait times for some products, rising costs for logistics and products. And yet we've also seen some gains. We've seen some positive effects. And a lot of these positive effects have been driven by digital transformation. And, you know, we've tried to offset, this digital transformation tries to offset, I guess, the vulnerabilities that our MSMEs have faced. So MSMEs have been the most vulnerable in this whole pandemic situation and a disruption of business. And among the MSMEs, many of them happen to be women-led firms, and this has had obviously a high impact, not only on women, but overall on employment, where many of our workers are from. But because of digital transformation, this has provided a potential for positive impact and a potential for leapfrogging opportunities. The digitization has affected both personal and professional lives, as mentioned earlier, and those businesses already digitized did well and excelled. And those who transformed themselves digitally were able to survive and have started to pick a path to growth. And I think this is something that we should continue to nurture. This digitalization has also been able to create new value added and in fact new businesses, to the point, as Louis was saying, where the digital service is almost, you know, equal to or larger in some cases than the professional service itself. But within this context, we all have to operate within a set of rules. And these rules have also been increasingly fragmented, incoherent, and this is a disadvantage to smaller companies rather than as opposed to the larger companies. There have been solutions, and we're happy to hear Ambassador Jaime Kogi tell us about the WTO's latest decisions. But these rules, as mentioned earlier by Debbie, need to go beyond e-commerce, beyond paper, and consider things like paperless trading, e-signatures, e-authorizations, and a whole host of other rules, including data privacy. At the end of the day, the digital transformation, while it allows people to get back on a growth path, they also run the risk of a gap, non-inclusion. So this digital divide we also need to consider. So I think as we forge ahead in building up the services roadmap, we need to be thinking, as someone said yesterday, we need to be thinking of building back better. That's to be resilient. But we also need to be thinking at the same time of building back broader for inclusion. On behalf of ABAC Philippines, I'd like to thank all our speakers from around the world who've joined us at all your respective time zones, and to also thank all our participants for staying with us for these past 2 days for what has been a very engaging and fruitful discussion. And my special thanks to Jane Drake Brockman, our fearless leader and convener, and to Patrick Chua, the lead staffer for ABAC Philippines, who also works with Jane in, to organize the PPD on services. We wish you all to stay safe, to keep in good health, and hopefully next time we meet, we will be meeting personally. Thank you very much, and good night from Manila.